I'll go ahead and start pretty close to on time. They should be on time. So today we're covering, so this is our forms day as part of our summer series. So every Thursday we'll be bringing to you some of the car forms library. I know through RevUp, we usually cover the purchase agreement and the listing agreement, but we don't talk about the other forms that should go with those. So this is one of those forms. These two forms, one of them actually partners with the BRBC, which is the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. And the other one partners with the purchase agreement, but it's also part of that BRBC. So we're kind of theme-wise today, we're on the BRBC, which is the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation form. Highly recommend that you utilize the BRBC. Okay, it's a super important form. That's what's going to protect you to get paid when you're working with buyers. And don't feel like, oh, well, we're really good friends. Well, even your really good friends sometimes make really bad choices. Even your kids sometimes make bad choices, huh, Anastasia? And use somebody else. Oh, she vanished.
Bad choices.
Bad
choices.
So use the BRBC. It protects you. It outlines the responsibilities of both you to the buyer and the buyer to you, and it creates that agency relationship. Now, in California, agency relationship can be implied, so it doesn't have to be in writing, but the only way to protect yourself and make sure that you're going to get paid at the end of the day is using that BRBC. We've even talked about it with regards to the like the Zillow leads and stuff, that sometimes you got to go show them one or two properties to build that rapport. And then we ask for that signature on the BRBC. So along with the BRBC, it states in there that we are going to disclose to the buyers. Remember, this was like a whole debacle last year or the year before about that most agents get compensated by the seller and who we really represent. And the buyer doesn't even know what the compensation is, and, you know, all these things. So that's when they started publishing the commission on the public side of the MLS. You'll see what the commission offered is on Zillow and Realtor and I can't even think of what the public side of the MLS site is, but that's the way buyers can see it. On the buyers reports now, it shows what the compensation is to their agents. And part of that comes along with this anticipated broker compensation disclosure, the ABCD. On the BRBC, which is the broker buyer representation and broker compensation form, it talks about that, hey, this is the commission that I'm going to get for a transaction that involves you. Okay. It also talks about the fact that if I receive compensation from another party, that takes away your commitment to pay the commission. And so that you know up front what you're going to have to pay, I'm going to disclose to you either at the time that we write the offer or the time that we're viewing properties, what that commission is going to be. Okay, so I think the default on the BRBC is that it's going to default that I'll disclose to you before we write an offer, which is where this ABCD form comes into play. This is how we disclose to them what the commission is on the property that we're writing the offer on. Now, there's another way to do it. One of the other ways is you could provide them with the buyer printout of the MLS listing, and that will also show it. I would just make sure that they sign off or that they initial that they've seen that page so that you have proof that you gave them that information. So the ABCD form, the anticipated broker compensation form, starts out with the buyer's name or the buyer's broker's name. So keep in mind, that's not your name. That's going to be your broker. So Realty One Group Fox is a real estate licensee providing services to, and then the buyer's name goes on that second line. The broker anticipates receiving compensation from the seller or the seller's broker or other. So for the most part, you're going to leave that defaulted. It's going to be the seller or the seller's broker. If buyer purchases,
Amy?
Yes.
Sorry, I have a question. I don't know if I missed it. We give them this when we're submitting an offer, or when do we give them this one?
Yeah, so if they've signed a BRBC, you've committed to letting them know up front, either at the time that they see the property or time of writing the offer, what the anticipated compensation is going to be from the seller, so they know what their obligation is. If you don't have that BRBC signed, then you don't have to include this.
Oh, okay.
So this really partners with that BRBC form, that the broker representation and buyer compensation.
Okay.
Yep. All right. Broker anticipates receiving commission. It's going to default most of the time to the seller or seller's broker. If buyer purchases any property identified below, compensation will be paid pursuant to a MLS service offer, a cooperating broker compensation form, the CBC, or other source specified in the column below. Buyer is aware that any commission paid by the seller directly or indirectly from the seller's broker affects the seller's total cost and expenses for the transaction and may impact the price the seller is willing to accept. If, for a specified property, broker has provided buyer with a copy of the document from the MLS that identifies the compensation offered to a cooperating broker for the listed property, that property may but does not have to be listed below. Broker independently or through escrow will disclose the final compensation broker receives from anyone other than the buyer. Here's where the buyer's brokerage firm information goes in with the DRE license number, and then your name here with the license number there. And this is where the buyer acknowledges the buyer read, understand, and received a copy of this anticipated broker compensation disclosure. By initialing the box below, buyer acknowledges being advised of the broker's anticipated compensation for the property identified, and the buyer signs there. So you sign the top line, the buyer signs the next line. And then the next section is where we fill it out. So remember, the default on the BRBC is at time of offer. You could check the box for at time of showing. If you were going to check the box at time of showing, you absolutely. So up here, it's talking about that. Hey, if they've provided the buyer with a copy of the document from the MLS that identifies the compensation offered, that the property does not have to be listed below. Okay. So that alleviates your obligation there. Again, I would get their initials on that report if you wanted it to be official as part of that disclosure. Or you could list it here, but the default on the BRBC is at time of offer before the offer is made, which is where you put it in. So that's the way I use it, would just be for the single property just that we're writing the offer on. Okay. And the buyer initials go here, the property address you're going to plug in here. So there might be multiple properties if they saw multiple and they're trying to make a decision on a property, or maybe they're submitting multiple offers, which is still legal. There might be multiple addresses here. This is where you're going to do the date first shown or the date the offer is being made. If you just click it, it will automatically put in today's date. But you can always go in there and change it if you want it to be the date you first showed the property. I would probably recommend putting the date, depending on what you filled out on the BRBC, to have it match. So if you said, hey, I'm gonna disclose compensation, anticipated compensation, before we write an offer, I'd probably put the date of the offer, versus if you were showing the properties, I would do it on the date first shown. Here is where you're going to put in the percentage of the purchase price. So this is where we're going to get it from, like the MLS, right? It shows you what the co-op compensation is. So oftentimes the co-op ends up being about 2.5%. Or if they're offering a flat rate, you could put it in there. And then you would check where you're getting that information. Did it come from the MLS, or did it come from a cooperating broker compensation form? So keep in mind that the property is not listed in the MLS or is not in an MLS where we belong to. We would need to find out what's being offered as the commission from the listing agent, and then fill out that cooperating broker compensation form. Or maybe it's a for sale by owner, so it wouldn't be the CBC or the MLS. It may be here, like on the attached form with the seller or whatever, right? So that's where that other line comes into play. Does anybody have any questions about how to fill out any of the sections so far?
So this is one per property or one per buyer?
It depends how you're utilizing it. You could put multiple properties on here. However, once it's signed, if you were showing properties, you would want to do this each time you showed properties, unless you're just providing them copies of the MLS forms, and then you don't necessarily need this form. But if you had left it defaulted to at time of offer, you didn't disclose before, you went and saw the properties, we're disclosing at time of offer, you're probably just going to have one property per form. Each time you write an offer, you would fill in the property address and what the anticipated broker compensation is.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So it's better to have a buyer rep sign an agreement.
You should always have the BRBC signed by your buyers.
I think so. Okay, sorry. I'm confused because my daughter interrupted me. If we have a buyer's rep sign agreement, we don't need to use this form.
If you do not have a BRBC signed, you do not need to use this form. If you have a BRBC form, you need to use this form because it outlines that you're going to provide them this information before you make an offer, or you can provide a copy of the report of the property from the MLS, and I would have them initial that report, like the buyer one-page report.
Oh, is this new?
It's not new. It actually came out like back in December. And we've talked about it a few times, but it does need to be utilized with that BRBC form.
Okay. All right. Got it. Thanks.
Okay. No problem.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It might be a dumb question, but so what do we do with the form? Do we submit it with the offer, or do we just keep it with the transaction after the offer is accepted?
We just keep it with the transaction after the offer is accepted. It does not need to get submitted over to the listing agent with an offer.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, perfect. All right. So, so this top section, again, we fill out the top, we sign here, buyer signs here, we fill out the house information down here, and the buyer's gonna initial for each property that is listed on here. If we made an offer, that offer wasn't accepted, we go to write another offer, I would just refill this out with the new property. I wouldn't just keep adding properties to it, although you could if you wanted a record of, but that might discourage your buyer because they'd be like, oh man, we're on our 5th offer. Look how all those other houses, I don't like this one as much as that first one. So I'd probably recommend just doing one property. So the next time you can come in here and just overwrite it, put the new property information in there, save the ones that were signed. So that's the top section. That's what gets completed and signed at the time of offer. The bottom section would get completed before the close of escrow, because in the BRBC, it talks about that we're going to disclose the information. It also talks about it up here. Let's see, broker independently or through escrow will disclose the final compensation broker receives for anyone other than the buyer. So keep in mind that oftentimes on the buyer's closing statement, it does not show the compensation that the buyer's agent is receiving from the buyer. Oftentimes that's shown on the seller's statement, not the buyer's statement. So we need to make sure that that's disclosed because number one, that's part of the BRBC, and number two, it's part of this form as well. So this form allows for that. So what you're going to do is we complete this top section, we sign here and sign here at the top. I'm surprised these sections aren't like numbered so we can identify them a little easily, but that's all right. So we're going to do that initially. When we get the offer accepted and we're moving towards closing, then we're going to complete the bottom section. And the bottom section to be completed upon close of escrow when the final compensation is determined, final compensation from persons other than the buyer. Buyer's broker has received compensation for buyer's purchase of the property located at, you're going to fill in the property address there that they're closing on, that they're actually buying, from the seller's broker in the amount of blank, and if applicable from blank in the amount of blank. So here, notice the percentages are now gone and we have to put in a dollar amount. So if our purchase price was 500,000 and our commission was 2.5%, then we're not going to put in 2.5% there. We're going to put in $12,500, the gross commission earned on that transaction. So that's what would go here. So if up here we had 2.5%, final sales price is 500,000, and here we write 12,500 would be 2.5% of that 500,000. Okay, now this is why this form also allows the secondary, that let's say that we are going to use the next form that we're going to talk about today, the SPBB, and we negotiated some commissions with the seller directly because maybe the listing agent was only offering 1.5%, and you're like, I don't work for 1.5%, and my buyer committed to paying 2.5%. And so I'm going to negotiate the other percent with the seller directly. We can do that, and I'll show you how. Then you might put that we're getting 1.5 here, which would be 7,500. And then we're going to check this box here from the seller in the amount of 5,000. Maybe we negotiated 1% with the seller so that it brings it to that 12,500. Okay. Now keep in mind that, just so everybody knows, in case somebody else is watching this from another brokerage, commissions are negotiable. They're not determined by, anything. There's no normal commission. It's to be determined by each brokerage. So I'm just throwing that out there. There's my caveat, but that's how you would do that. If you wanted more commission than what was being offered, we can negotiate it in with the seller directly. Okay. There's another way to do it too, just so everybody knows. If, let's say, the listing agent was only offering 1.5% and you wanted 2.5%, you can negotiate a 1% closing cost credit towards the buyers instead of negotiating directly with the seller for the commission. And then you would use that BRBC, which showed the buyers were responsible for 2.5%. The listing agent's paying 1.5%, and the buyers are getting a credit for $5,000 to cover their additional percent. So that's the other way to do it. We can either negotiate with the listing agent directly to try to increase it. We can negotiate in a closing cost credit that would cover that difference, or we can negotiate with the SPBB form. Yeah, SPBB form directly with the seller. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about what I just went over there?
I do.
Okay.
So you're saying we can use this or the client page 1 report and have them initial it?
Yep.
So what would we do with that? We would just keep it or attach it to the files at the end?
I would probably attach it. I would upload it to SkySlope with additional addendums, or additional documents. I don't know what it's listed in our SkySlope, but it's either additional addendums or additional documents. And I would make sure it's uploaded in there. Ultimately, if we have a BRBC signed, and you could always upload it with the BRBC. So once we get in the contract, you could upload the buyer representation agreement. You could upload the copy of the signed MLS page or initialed MLS page showing that you disclose the commission. And then you just want to make sure you disclose it at the end as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know exactly where our department that reviews everything. There's a name for that. I can't think of what it is. Compliance department. Our compliance department really wants it. And I don't think it's necessarily being required, and it should be. So just make sure you upload it so your file is complete. So yeah, any other questions before we complete this form? All right. So we're going to disclose the final amount here when we're getting close to the closing. You're going to fill in the buyer's brokerage firm again, license number, agent name, license number goes there. And then the buyer's initials below are not required, but can be used as evidence that buyer has been notified of the file compensation. So have your buyer's initial here. So again, up here initially, when we go to write the offer, you're gonna sign at the top. The buyers are gonna sign at the top. Nobody's gonna fill this bottom section out, and nobody's going to sign or initial down here until we're moving towards the close of escrow. And then at the close of escrow, or moving towards the close of escrow, you're gonna sign and have your buyer's initial. Okay. Any other questions about the ABCD form? It's as easy as ABCD. All right. Fabulous. We will move on to the next form. So in case you haven't been using the newer forms editor, this is the joy of the new forms editor. With the old one, I would have to close out and then reopen with the other form that I want to cover. But today, because I'm in the new forms editor, I can just come down here and click it and drag it up here. And then here we are, where we can view that one. So the next one is the SPBB, the seller's payment to the buyer's broker. So as part of the BRBC, that buyer representation and broker compensation form, it talks about that the buyer is authorizing us to be able to negotiate our commission directly with the seller. That's the default on that form. Okay, so as long as you don't change anything, that's the default, is that we have the right to negotiate commission directly with the seller. And then on the residential purchase agreement, there's a box that you check where you're going to negotiate the commission directly with the seller. So number one, in order to negotiate the commission with the seller, you should have the BRBC form signed by your buyer, giving you permission to do so. And then number two, you've got to check the box on the RPA stating that that is your intention and that you're going to include this SPBB form. Okay, seller's payment to buyer's broker. This form also came out last December, although most people are not using it. And again, it may be more advantageous for your buyers if you negotiated the difference in commission as a closing cost credit rather than negotiating directly with the listing or the buyer, the seller, whoever this is for, negotiating directly with the seller for an increased commission. Okay, because the seller is going to see a closing cost credit as, oh, the buyers need that in order to close escrow, where the seller is going to see, oh, the agent's trying to negotiate the commission up. Well, that's greedy. Well, no, it's not, but we deserve to get paid for our services. So, but that's how they're going to view it for the most part. So I would always look to probably negotiate it first with a closing cost credit before I did this form. But you can do it however you want to in your real estate business. So the seller payment to the buyer's broker, the SPBB form, the following terms and conditions are hereby incorporated and made part of the purchase agreement or other. So it automatically defaults to the purchase agreement. You're going to make sure you put the date of the purchase agreement there. That's going to be the date that got printed on the upper left-hand corner of page 1 of the RPA. Goes right here. The property address should get put in here, and then the buyer's names go in there, and the seller's names go in on the next line. So that's the top. Notice the amount or rate of real estate commission is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiated between seller and broker. Real estate commissions include all compensation and fees to broker. Okay, so there's your little caveat again. Then we move into, we've got some numbered options here. Number one, the buyer has entered into a written agreement to compensate buyer's broker X% of the purchase price, or if checked, X for the purchase of the property. So this would be what is filled in on your BRBC. So for the most part, if you fill in 2.5%, you can put it there. Maybe you fill in 3% on your BRBC. Okay. So whatever you put there, or if you put a flat rate on your BRBC, you could do that as well. You would check this box instead and fill in the flat rate here. Number two is, as of the date, this seller payment for buyer's broker's document is signed by buyer and pursuant to the MLS or blank, seller's broker has agreed to pay buyer's broker X% of the purchase price, or if checked, a flat rate upon completion of the transaction. So it'd be MLS, or this might be where you put like the CBC form, right? So maybe you did a cooperating broker compensation form. That'd be the CBC form. You could check it there, but for the most part, it's going to default to the MLS. And then here's what you would put as disclosed in the MLS. So maybe it's 2.5%, or maybe it's 1.5%, or maybe it's 2, right? So whatever it would, you would put it there. The seller's broker has agreed to pay buyer's broker 2% of the purchase price, or if checked, you would check the box and put in a flat rate if they were offering a flat rate. Seller agrees to pay buyer's broker 1% of the purchase price, right? We're looking to close this gap, or at least close part of it. Maybe we're only asking for the seller to pay 0.5%, right? So you can figure that out, what you want to put there, but that's where you'd fill that in. Or if checked, a flat rate. So you could put in a flat rate there. Enter a percentage or amount which is no greater than the applicable percentage or amount in paragraph 1, less the applicable percentage or amount in paragraph 2. So if this is 3% and this is 2%, I can't put 1.5% here because that exceeds 3% minus 2% only leaves me with 1% deficiency. So the seller is only going to cover the deficiency between what the buyer has agreed to pay and what the listing agent is offering. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Fabulous. So the max that we can put there is 1%, the deficiency. Okay. Number 4 is the buyer authorizes escrow holder upon request to deliver to seller a copy of the portion of the written agreement between the buyer and the buyer's broker, identifying the amount of compensation buyer has agreed to pay buyer's broker. So, right, so you don't have to send over the whole BRBC form. You could just send over the page or the section that shows the amount of compensation the buyer has agreed to pay. Okay, that's number 4. So the seller can request that, and we would have to provide it to them. If the buyer's broker is the same as the seller's broker, okay, so if we're under the same brokerage, and then the amount specified in the MLS shall apply in the manner specified in paragraph 2 and 3. Additionally, if the broker has agreed in a listing agreement to reduce the amount of compensation in the event of dual agency, the amount of compensation specified in the MLS will still apply to offset the compensation that the buyer has agreed to pay buyer's broker. So ultimately, if you've agreed to a reduced commission, if you're doing dual agency, that's going to be reduced on the listing agent side of the transaction, not the buyer side of the transaction. Okay. So whatever's listed in the MLS still goes towards the buyer's side. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? I know that part, it sounds a little confusing to me. We're good.
Yes, yes.
All right. Fabulous. By signing below, the buyer and seller each acknowledge that they've read, understand, accept, and have received a copy of the seller payment for buyer's broker. They are changing this form a little bit. Hold on, I think I threw it in the trash yesterday. Give me just a second. Let me pull up the changes. SPBB. Nope. Darn. All right. They've changed the wording just a little bit, I believe, to state that this can be countered. So they just updated the verbiage a little bit on it, and that new form should come out soon. But it allows for this to be countered, so it just changes that verbiage a little bit there. Hold on, we're gonna look and see if I can find it. List. Oh, there it is. I knew it was in here. Oh, well, take it out of the trash.
We know how you really feel about these forms.
I don't want them sitting on my computer. All right, here is the updated form. So, oh, they did a lot of changes. So here, let's go over the changes real quick. The top is the same, purchase agreement or other dated property buyer seller. Only use this form if buyer and buyer's agents have already entered into a buyer representation agreement, car form BRBC. So you can't use it if you don't have a BRBC. So they clarified it. And the buyer has an obligation to pay buyer's broker compensation pursuant to the representation agreement after first deducting any amount that the buyer's broker will be receiving from the seller's broker through the MLS or other agreement, car form CBC, right? So only if there's a deficiency between what's being offered and what's been agreed to pay. And buyer is asking seller to pay buyer's broker all or a portion of the balance due buyer's broker under the representation agreement. This amount shall be into on paragraph 3. So it defaults. So you have to, all three. Number 1, you have to have a BRBC already signed. Number 2, you have to have a deficiency between what's being offered in the MLS and the BRBC. And number 3, we're going after and asking the seller to pay that difference. That's when you would use this form. Seller may accept, reject, or counter this term as with any other term in the buyer's offer. So it's just incorporated in as part of the purchase agreement. So if the seller were countering this as part of the counter offer, they would still sign it just like we do on the residential purchase agreement, but then the terms would be identified in the counter offer. And you want to make sure you check that box on the RPA that it's subject to the attached counter offer. Okay. Any questions about the top instructions? Okay. The next letters are the same. The buyer representation agreement with compensation. We're just filling in what was on that BRBC that we already covered. Compensation from the seller's broker to buyer's broker. So that's what's in the MLS or the CBC form. Goes on 2, which we already talked about. And then the amount we're asking the seller to pay goes on line 3, just like what we already talked about on the other form. Here we've got the buyer's broker escrow can provide a copy of the BRBC that shows the amount the buyer agreed to pay us. And then the last one is just that same caveat about dual agency and how that gets applied. So the steps down here are the same. The only thing that changed was they added these instructions to the top of the form. And then the buyer and seller sign off on this. Okay. So there are the changes on that form. Any questions? I was just making sure there weren't any changes to the ABCD form. All right. That concludes our training today of the ABCD form and the SPBB form. So now you know what those forms are when you see them, and when you know there's an option there to negotiate your commission higher directly with the seller, or you can make sure that you disclose the information about compensation to your buyers on that anticipated broker compensation disclosure. Does anybody have any questions on those 2 forms or any other forms? We've still got time, so I'm happy to answer any forms related questions that you may have.
So let's say you make an error on when you're doing a listing agreement. You make an error on the commission. Do you just do an addendum to fix that?
You would do so anytime it's between you and a seller or you and a buyer, so broker and client instead of buyer and seller, you would do it on a modification of terms. And they now have a modification of listing. It's modification of listing buyer representation. So let's add that form in. There we go. See, I didn't even have to close out. So this would be a modification of listing buyer representation or other agreement between principal and broker. So anytime you're making changes to a listing agreement or that buyer representation agreement, you would do it on this MT form, the modification of terms form.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question because everyone kind of gets lost there because you're like, well, we're changing it, so it should be an addendum. That makes sense, but which does. However, when you look at the bottom signature lines of the addendum, it's between a buyer and a seller, which doesn't match. So this is the only form for changes between a client and the brokerage.
Okay.
Any other questions? Forms related? Did you all find this helpful? Was it good? Are you enjoying the forms trainings?
It was very helpful. Thank you.
Good. Good.
Yes, very knowledgeable.
Good. Make sure before you leave today that you click on the link that just got posted in the chat box to log your attendance. And I was gonna pull up what next week's forms training was while you guys are logging your attendance, if I can find a page that will allow me to open up my schedule. Unless Abby beats me to it and posts it in the chat box. Hold on. Now it's a race. All right, let's see here. Oh, wrong Google Drive. My computer's so slow. All right, I'm almost there. I will tell you what you have to look forward to next week. Oh, is it Boomtown next week? Do we not have forms on Thursday? Oh. Okay. Next week we're covering the we have Boomtown next week on one of the days. Hold on. And then for the forms training on Thursday, we're covering the SIP and the RLAS. So the seller in possession after the close of escrow, which is for if the seller's remaining in possession for 29 days or less. And if they're remaining for 30 days or more, we use the RLAS, or the residential listing lease after sale. On Tuesday, we have we're going to dive into just kind of an overview of Boomtown, like a just entry level look at it, how to put your people in there, how to set things up, how to navigate through Boomtown so that you can kind of look and see what that CRM has to offer, since it's being offered to us free from the office. So we'll be going through that. If you are one of the Zillow agents, you have like a premium Boomtown account versus our regular agents have an entry-level Boomtown account. Just so everybody knows, we're covering the entry-level Boomtown account next week so that everybody knows what's available to them. Once we kind of cover, we'll go Boomtown 1.0 and then Boomtown 2.0. We got 2 different Boomtown trainings this summer. Then I can have Ed upgrade my account to the premium. So if you're on the Zillow team, you have more questions about what you can do on there, I'll have that access as well. But for now, I wanted just the regular office access to it so that I can kind of train on that and know what the limits are if you're just an agent in the office. And then on Wednesday, so Tuesday at 3 o'clock, remember Tuesdays at 3, Tuesday at 3, we have Boomtown. Wednesday is the office huddle, so we have no class on Wednesday. I expect you guys all to show up for the office huddle and let me know what happens and what goes on and all the announcements. And then on Thursday, we'll be covering the SIP and the RLAS, the seller in possession and the residential lease after sale. Thank you, Abby, for providing that information to me. I really appreciate it. Make sure you guys log your attendance, and I will see you next week. If anybody needs anything, feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
You are welcome. Have a fabulous day.
Thank you, Amy.
Yep.